So I'd like to describe one example of ageism in the workplace and describe this study in more detail so that you have a good understanding of it. So one example of ageism is that even if older people are able to get the job that they want, when they're in that job, they have a harder time keeping that job. And part of that is bias in how they're perceived and the consequences for any kind of mistake they make. So in one study, they showed that if an elderly person made a mistake versus a younger person, the elderly person received more negative consequences for that mistake. So this was a clever social psychological study where participants read a scenario, and this scenario employed an employee named Pat, probably because it was sort of gender neutral, it could be a man or a woman, and Pat made some big mistake. And in this paragraph that participants read, all they altered was the age of Pat. So they read about a mistake Pat made. In one condition, half the participants read that Pat was 31, and then in the other condition, Pat was 63. After they read about this mistake, participants answered questions about how likely they would recommend that Pat resign from the job because of his mistake or his or her mistake. I forgot to mention they also measured the degree of ageism that the participant had. So, how ageist was that person? And so they found several effects. First, they found a main effect of age. So, you can see on the left the squares above the circle dot, right? So, if participants read that Pat was 63 versus that Pat was 31, they were more likely to recommend that Pat resign, even though they read about the same exact mistake, right? So just based on age, they penalized Pat more. You can see the same gap on the right side of the graph with the high level of ageism, right? The square is above the circle again. So, across different levels of ageism, no matter how ageist the participant was, even if you were not very ageist, you still penalized Pat more if Pat was 63. Second, there was an interaction where you can see that the gap between the square and the circle is bigger on the right side of the graph. So if you had a high level of ageism, you were really likely to penalize Pat, and you can see the highest point in the graph is on the right side in the upper right side. So if Pat was 63 versus 31 and you were ageist, you're even more likely to penalize Pat for the mistake, compared to on the left side of the graph where that difference between the square and the dot is smaller. So that's an interaction between age of Pat or age of the target and your own level of ageism.